Section 13 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2 by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 13, Part 2. The Count was opposed in the measure of leaving the harbor of Newport by all the American and many of the French officers, but by none more strenuously than the brave Marquis de Lafayette, who followed him to Boston with the utmost celerity to endeavor to expedite his return. Footnote: zealous to promote the same object, the commissioners of the Navy Board at Boston, with great dispatch, repaired, watered, victualled, and equipped the ships, under the command of the Count d'Estaing. It not being practicable to return to Rhode Island, he in a few weeks after sailed in complete order for the West Indies. End of footnote. This misfortune damped the ardor of the militia, some of whom had, more from ostentation than bravery, voluntarily engaged in this expedition. Near 3,000 men relinquished their posts and left the island in a day. Many of them were influenced to this precipitate desertion by the conduct of Major General Hancock, who, in spite of the remonstrances of friends and forgetful of the hazard of popularity, left all in the moment of danger and repaired to Boston. General Sullivan, not disheartened by these unexpected events, nor discouraged by the untoward accidents that hitherto attended his operations, kept his station 14 days after the secession of so large a part of his forces. Nor did he suffer his troops to be idle. Several skirmishes took place that kept up apprehension on the one side and a military ardor on the other, but none of more importance than an action on the morning of the 29th, when a cannonade began early on both sides and continued some hours with doubtful success. A detachment of the British troops under Colonel Campbell was routed and fled in confusion, leaving many dead on the field, among whom a favorite nephew of the commander was killed by his side. After this, Sullivan and his officers, judging it not prudent to attack a superior force entrenched within their lines, withdrew to their own camp, while the British employed the ensuing night in strengthening and fortifying theirs. Within 3 days after this rencounter, an express arrived from General Washington with information that Lord Howe had again sailed from New York, and that Sir Henry Clinton had himself embarked with 4,000 men for the relief of Rhode Island. On the same day, the Marquis de Lafayette returned from Boston and reported it impossible for the Count d'Estaing to arrive there again, timely for any operations of consequence, and as nothing effectual could be done without the aid of naval force, General Sullivan thought proper to withdraw his troops from the island. His retreat was conducted with such secrecy, silence, and dexterity as discovered the judgment and ability of the experienced commander. He had in his council some officers of distinguished name who fully justified his conduct through the whole of this unsuccessful expedition: Greene, Lafayette, and Lawrence, Fleury, Wade, Glover, Knox, Livingston, and Talbot, with many other excellent officers, had the mortification to quit the field, without the laurel so fair a prospect of military glory had waved in view. Footnote: the noble, disinterested sentiments of this gentleman, who was then aide-de-camp to General Washington, were exhibited in his reply to Congress, who, for his distinguished bravery in this and other actions, had advanced him to the rank of lieutenant colonel. Mr. Lawrence's acceptance would have superseded some officers in the family of the commander, earlier in commission. Apprehensive that it might create some uneasiness among them, he declined the honor. He observed that having been a spectator of the convulsions occasioned in the army by disputes of rank, he held the tranquillity of it too dear to be instrumental in disturbing it. End of footnote. This disappointment occasioned some temporary murmurings against the conduct of d'Estaing, and even the connection with France. A squabble soon after the fleet arrived at Boston between some French and American sailors heightened the uneasiness, but the most respectable people, disposed to view with a favorable eye and to place the utmost confidence in their untried allies, all censure was hushed, and a discreet silence in the more prudent prevented or counteracted all invidious observations from the less candid. Lord Howe arrived in the harbor of Newport with 100 sail of ships of war and transports the morning after Sullivan's retreat. Admiral Byron was hourly expected to join him. Thus, so superior in strength, there was every reason to expect Boston would be the next object of attack. In consequence of this appearance, the Count d'Estaing, who found it would require time to victual, water, and equip his shattered fleet for a second cruise, judged it necessary to fortify several advantageous islands in the harbor, and thus be in readiness for the reception of the British fleets, if they should be again disposed to visit Boston. Lord Howe, before he returned to New York, went round and looked into the harbor of Boston, but finding most of the ships belonging to the French fleet repaired, and Castle William and the islands in a defensible state, he did not think proper to make any hostile attempt on the town. Not perfectly pleased with the American war, and disgusted at some things relative to his own command, his lordship resigned his commission soon after this and repaired to England. He left the American seas in September 1778. When his lordship arrived in England, he complained publicly that he had been deceived into the command, and deceived while in it. Tired and disgusted with the service, he had been compelled to resign, and that he had suffered too much effort to risk a return to any situation that might terminate in equal mortification. He observed that he must be excused from any employment while the present ministry continued in office, being convinced by decisive experience that he not only risked his own honor and professional character in the attempt, but that under such counsels he was as sensible as those who have been earlier in opposition, that no essential service could be rendered his country. But though we see him no more on the American theater, yet, notwithstanding his dissatisfaction with the conduct of administration, Lord Howe again, before the conclusion of peace, acted a conspicuous part under the renowned flag of Great Britain. The celebrated Bougainville, who had before explored the other side of the globe, was, with many other officers of high rank and distinction, for the first time in the American seas. They were everywhere welcomed as the generous friends of the United States, the patrons of liberty, and the supporters of the rights of men. But as there had not yet been time to prove the sincerity of either party, the old officers who remembered the late war between England and France, when America hugged herself in the protection of Britain and adopted all her opinions, looked as if they wished rather than believed all ancient prejudices obliterated. Footnote. Some jealousies had arisen while at Rhode Island on some points of etiquette between the Count d'Estaing and the commander of the American forces. These had been amicably adjusted, yet the pride of all the military characters had been too much hurt for the wound to be instantly healed. End of footnote. They seemed silently to half doubt the reality of that friendship which appeared in the politeness of their reception from a people of a different religion, language, habits, and manners, and at first seemed reluctantly to hold back that flow of affection which the Americans were ready to return in full measure. As to the younger class, unconscious of injury, ambitious for glory, and eager for the humiliation of Britain, hope danced in their eye. Every feature displayed the wish of mutual confidence, and with honest joy they extended their arms to embrace their new allies. Yet the squadrons of the House of Bourbon riding in the ports and fortifying the American harbors against their natural friends, the parent of the once loyal and affectionate colonies, was an event which, though precipitated by the folly of Britain, had outrun the expectations of America, nor could such a circumstance fail to excite the most serious recollections and contemplations both of the philosopher and the politician. The timely and judicious movement of General Sullivan disappointed the expectations of Sir Henry Clinton, who flattered himself he should arrive soon enough to cut off the retreat of the American army. When he found they had withdrawn, he immediately left the neighborhood of Rhode Island and returned to New York after he had dispatched Major General Gray at the head of a large detachment on a marauding expedition against some defenseless towns in the Massachusetts. The first attack was on Bedford, a small town on the river Acushnet. He landed in the evening. The inhabitants, alarmed at this unexpected attack, most of them fled and left their property a prey to their enemies. When they returned in the morning, they found the Britons retired, but to their inexpressible mortification, almost everything of value was destroyed or carried off. Houses, warehouses, magazines, and stores, with near 100 sail of shipping, were burnt on the Bedford and Fairhaven sides of the river. After this feat, Gray proceeded to Martha's Vineyard, laid the inhabitants under contribution, and demanded a surrender of their arms. From thence he visited Nantucket and the neighboring isles, and with the plunder of 15 or 20,000 cattle and sheep, for the use of the army at New York, he returned with his party, exulting in depredations that would have been disgraceful to an officer of much inferior character and abilities. Footnote: a number of refugees from the state of Massachusetts aided Gray in depredations on their countrymen and former friends. From a regard to the feelings of some of their connections still living in America, we forbear to name them. End of footnote. Sir Henry Clinton, pleased with the success of this expedition, sent Gray immediately on to aid a similar mode of war on the Jersey coast. Lord Cornwallis had, with a large body of troops, taken post between the North River and the Hackensack. General Nyhaven, with another division, was posted in a parallel position on the other side of the North River. Thus were they conveniently situated to guard their foraging parties and distress the country by sudden depredations and continual havoc during the remainder of the autumn. General Gray, with his usual activity, had gained intelligence of the insecure situation in which a regiment commanded by Colonel Baylor had reposed themselves for the night of the 24th of September. A party sent on with orders to give no quarter, cut off the guards, and surprised the unhappy victims asleep in an outhouse. They awoke, submitted, implored quarter, and were massacred in an hour. Only 10 or 12 escaped with life, after they were barbarously wounded, stripped, and left for dead. This remnant so far recovered as, by favor of the darkness, to reach the post of their friends, and detailed the horrid transaction. They agreed on oath that they and their companions had all surrendered as soon as they found themselves in the enemy's hands, and asked only for life. But the savage cry was, "Kill them! Kill them! We have orders to give no quarter," and the barbarous echo was kept up till every man was, or appeared to be, murdered. Footnote: see a particular detail of this transaction in the British Remembrancer, with the affidavits of the few soldiers that escaped the massacre. End of footnote. End of section 13. Section 14 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 13, Part 3. A repetition of the same cruel policy soon after took place on the surprise of a party of Pulaski's light infantry. Some deserters had betrayed them into the hands of the British. Several hundred of these unhappy men were butchered without mercy after the surrender of their arms. The Baron de Bose, a Polish nobleman, was among the slain. An apology was afterwards attempted by pleading that they had received information that Count Pulaski, in orders to his legion, had enjoined that no quarter should be given to any that might fall into their hands. This was denied both by the Count and his officers, but had it been true that a foreign nobleman, hardened amidst the barbarities of Polish Confederacy, could so far deviate from the laws of humanity as to give such an order, the example should never have been followed by the polite and gallant Englishmen. But in this war, they seem to have lost those generous feelings of compassion to the vanquished foe that must ever be deemed honorary to the human character. A counterpart to the conduct of the more refined, though little more humanized commanders of the predatory parties in the middle and northern colonies was exhibited in the southern borders by the savage allies of the wilderness. This was dreadfully realized by the inhabitants of Wyoming, a young settlement on the eastern branch of the Susquehanna. The population of this once happy spot had been remarkably rapid, and when the furious civil discord first appeared among them, it contained 8 townships of 5 miles square each. They were situated in a mild climate, in a country fertile, and beautifully displaying a picturesque appearance of that kind of primitive simplicity, only enjoyed before the mind of man is contaminated by ambition or gold. But party rage had spread its baneful influence to the remotest corners of America, and political animosities had at this period poisoned the peace, even of the most distant villages, where simplicity, friendship, and industry had reigned, until the fell fiend, which prompts to civil war, made its frightful appearance, attended by all the horrors imagination can paint. The inhabitants of this favored spot, perhaps more zealous than discreet, had so far participated the feelings of all America, as voluntarily to raise and send forward 1,000 men to join the Continental Army. This step disclosed the embers of opposition that had hitherto lain concealed in the bosoms of a number long disaffected to the American, and warmly attached to the royal cause. A rancorous spirit immediately burst from the latent spark, which divided families and separated the tenderest connections. Animosity soon arose to such a height that some of the most active members of this flourishing and happy society abandoned their plantations, forsook their friends, joined and instigated the neighboring savages to molest the settlements, and assisted in the perpetration of the most unheard-of cruelties. Several outrages had been committed by small parties, and many threatening appearances had so far alarmed the inhabitants that most of them had repaired to some fortresses early erected for their defense against the native savages. Yet there was no apprehension of a general massacre and extermination till the beginning of July, 1778, when an army of near 2,000 men made its appearance on the Susquehanna and landed on their borders. This body was composed of the motley materials of Indians, Tories, half-blooded Englishmen, and British renegados, headed by one Butler, who had nothing human about him except a rough external figure of a man. All the inhabitants of those weak, defenseless settlements capable of bearing arms embodied and put themselves under the direction of a person of the same name, a near relation of the commander of the savages. This man, either through fear, weakness, or misplaced confidence, listened to the offers of treaty from his more artful kinsman, and suffered himself with 400 men to be drawn from Fort Kingston by a delusive flag that alternately advanced and retired, as if apprehensive of danger. Caught by the snare, he was completely surrounded before he had any suspicion of deception, and his whole party cut off, notwithstanding they fought with the spirit becoming their desperate situation. The victor immediately pushed on, invested the garrison thus indiscreetly left, and demanded a surrender. The demand was accompanied by the horror display of a great number of scalps, just torn from the heads, and yet warm with the blood of their nearest friends and relations. In this situation of wretchedness, embittered by impotent resentment, Colonel Donaldson, on whom the command had devolved, finding resistance impracticable, went out himself with a flag to ask the terms of surrender. To this humiliating question, the infamous Butler replied, with all the sang-froid of the savage and the laconism of an ancient Greek, "The hatchet." The unfortunate Donaldson returned in despair, yet he bravely defended the fort until most of his men had fallen by his side, when the barbarians without shut up this and a neighboring garrison, where a number of women and children had repaired for safety, and setting fire to both, they enjoyed the infernal pleasure of seeing them perish promiscuously in the flames lighted by their bloody hands. Footnote: the transactions at Wyoming are recorded above, agreeably to the most authentic accounts at the time. End of footnote. After this catastrophe, the most shocking devastation was spread through the townships, while some were employed in burning the houses, setting fire to the cornfields, and rooting out every trait of improvement. Others were cruelly and wantonly imbruing their hands in the blood of their parents, their brothers, and every near connection, who had unfortunately held different political opinions. But a particular detail of the transactions of savages, stimulated by the agents of more refined and polished nations, with passions whetted by revenge, without principle to check its operation, is too painful to the writer and too disgraceful to human nature to dwell on. Nor is it less painful to the impartial historian to relate the barbarous, though by them deemed necessary, vengeance soon after taken by the Americans. The conflagration spread over the beautiful country of the Illinois by a Colonel Clark of Virginia equally awakes compassion, and was a counterbalance for the sufferings of the miserable Wyomings. It is true the Illinois and other distant warlike tribes were at the instigation of Governor Hamilton, the British commander of Detroit, generally assisting in the measures perpetrated under Butler and Brant nearer the frontiers, and perhaps the law of retaliation may, in some measure, justify the depredations of Clark. Footnote: Governor Hamilton was afterwards captured by Clark. End of footnote. This intrepid ranger left Virginia in the course of this summer, with a few adventurers hardy as himself, and traversed a country of 1100 or 1200 miles in extent, and surmounting all the hardships that imagination can paint, through a wilderness inhabited only by strolling hunters from among the savages, and the wild beasts that prowled before them. Through hunger, fatigue, and sufferings innumerable, they reached the upper Mississippi. The Indian inhabitants, who had there long enjoyed a happy climate and the fruits of a fertile soil, under a high degree of cultivation, fearless of danger from their distance from civilized neighbors, were surprised by Clark and his party. Their crops were destroyed, their settlements broken up, their villages burnt, the principal of which was Kaskaskias. This town contained near 300 houses, and it had not been surprised at midnight by these desperate invaders, bold, outrageous, and near starving in the wilderness. The natives might successfully have defended their lives and their plantations, but not a man escaped seasonably to alarm the neighboring tribes. A British officer, one Rocheblave, who acted as governor and paymaster for American scalps, was taken and sent to Virginia with many written proofs of the cruel policy of inciting the fury of savages against the American settlements. From Quebec, Detroit, Michilimackinac, etc., these orders everywhere appeared under the signature of the chief magistrates, acting in the name of the British king. Some of their principal warriors were made prisoners. The remainder, who escaped the sword, had only to fly farther through a trackless wilderness, if possible, to procure some new lodgment beyond the reach of civilized pursuers. nor did the Cherokees, Muskingums, the Mohawks, and many other savage tribes feel less severely than the Illinois the resentment of the Americans for their attachment to the British nation and their cruelties practiced on the borders of the Atlantic states. An expedition entrusted to the conduct of General Sullivan against the Six Nations, who had generally been better disposed towards Americans than most of the savage tribes, was replete with circumstances that must wound the feelings of the compassionate heart. While the lovers of cultivation and improvement among all mankind will be touched by a retaliation bordering, to say the least, on savage fury, the sudden and unexpected destruction of a part of the human species, enjoying domestic quiet in the simplicity of nature, awakes the feelings of the first. The second must be disturbed in his philosophical pursuits of cultivation and improvement, when he contemplates fire and sword destroying all in their way, and houses too well built to be the workmanship of men in a state of rude nature, the prey of conflagration, and kindled by the hands of the cultivators of the arts and sciences. Footnote: by the testimony of British writers, this description is not exaggerated. See their registers and histories. End of footnote. The rooting up of gardens, orchards, cornfields, and fruit trees, which by their variety and growth discovered that the industrious hand of cultivation had been long employed to bring them to perfection, cannot be justified, more especially where there is a mind capable of looking forward to their utility, and back to the time and labor it has caused to bring them to maturity. But General Sullivan, according to his own account in his letters to the Commander-in-Chief, to Congress, to his friends, and to others, spared no vestige of improvement, and appeared little less proud of this war upon nature than he was of his conquest of the savages. Footnote: see General Sullivan's account of this expedition on the public records, dated September 30th, 1779. End of footnote. The difficulties, dangers, and fatigues of the march required courage, firmness, and perseverance. Hunger and famine assailed them before they reached the fertile borders of the pleasant and well-settled Indian towns. Yet General Sullivan and his party finished the expedition in as short a time as could be expected, and to all public appearance met the approbation of Congress and of the Commander-in-Chief. Yet there were some things in the demeanor of General Sullivan that disgusted some of his officers, and raised a censure on his conduct that made him unhappy, and led him to resign his military command. His health was indeed broken, which he imputed to the fatigues encountered on his hazardous march. Yet he lived many years after this period, and was advanced to the highest stations in the civil administration of the state of New Hampshire, and died with the reputation of a brave and active officer, both in military and civil life. End of section 14. Section 15 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 13, Conclusion. General Sullivan had acquitted himself during his military command with valor and reputation in many instances. During the ravages of the British on the Jersey shore, in the latter part of the summer of 1777, he had gained much honor by an expedition to Staten Island, concerted by himself. This he undertook without any orders from the Commander-in-Chief, and for this a court of inquiry was appointed to examine into his conduct. His reasons for such a step without permission or command were thought justifiable. He brought off a great number of prisoners, officers, soldiers, and Tories, who had frequently made incursions on the borders of the Jerseys, and harassed, plundered, and murdered the inhabitants in their sudden depredations. It appeared that General Sullivan had conducted this business with great prudence and success. He was, by the court of inquiry, acquitted with honor and applause for planning and executing to great advantage a design from which so much benefit had resulted. It may be thought by some an apology sufficient for the invasion of Clark and Sullivan, of Pickens, Van Schick, and others, that the hostile dispositions of the aboriginals had always led them to imbrue their hands in the blood of the borderers. The worries of the distant tribes, either instigated by their own ferocity and resentment, or the influence of Europeans inimical to the United States, were ever ready to molest the young settlements. Jealous of their encroachments, the natives viewed them with such a hostile eye that no treaties were binding. When a favorable opportunity presented, they always attacked the whites, perhaps from the same impulse that in human nature prompts all mankind, whether civilized or savage, to resist the invaders of his territory. Indeed, their condition and their sufferings from the first emigration of the Europeans, their corruptions in consequence thereof, their wars and their extirpation from a vast tract of the American continent, must excite a solemn pause in the breast of the philosopher, while he surveys the wretchedness of savage life and sighs over its misery. Yet he is not relieved when he contemplates the havoc among civilized nations, the changes in society, the prostration of principle, and the revolutions permitted by Providence in this speck of creation. The rivers of blood through which mankind generally wade to empire and greatness must draw out the tear of compassion, and every sympathetic bosom will commiserate the sufferings of the whole human race, either friends or foes, whether dying by the sword, sickness, or remorse, under the splendid canopy reared by their own guilty hands. These, with equal pity, look into the wilderness. They see the naked hunter groaning out his fierce soul on his native turf, slain by the tomahawk of his own savage tribe, or wounded by some neighboring hordes, that prowled through an existence little elevated above the brute. Both stages of society excite compassion, and both intimate to the rational mind that this is but the road to a more improved and exalted state of existence. But the unhappy race of men hunted throughout the vast wilderness of America were the original proprietors of the soil, and if they have not civilization, they have valor. If they have not patriotism, they have a predilection to country, and are tenacious of their hunting grounds. However the generous or humane mind may revolt at the idea, there appears a probability that they will be hunted from the vast American continent, if not from off the face of the globe, by Europeans of various descriptions, aided by the interested Americans, who all consider valor in an Indian only as a higher degree of ferocity. The strenuous efforts to retain the boundaries assigned them by nature and providence are viewed with the contempt by those descriptions of persons, or rather as a sanction to their own rapacity, and a warrant from heaven to exterminate the hapless race. But the rivers, the mountains, the deserts, the savages clad in armor, with other destroyers of men, as well as the voice of heaven and their natural boundaries, forbid these encroachments on the naked forester, content with the produce of nature in his own grounds, and the game that plays in his own wild woods, which his ancestors have possessed from time immemorial. The ideas of some Europeans as well as Americans that the rude tribes of savages cannot be civilized by the kind and humane endeavors of their neighbors is absurd and unfounded. What were once the ancestors of the most refined and polite modern nations, but rude, ignorant savages, inured to all the barbarous customs and habits of present existing tribes. Nature has been equal in its operations with regard to the whole human species. There is no difference in the moral or intellectual capacity of nations, but what arises from advantageous circumstances that give some a more early and rapid improvement in civilization than others. This gradual rise from the rude stages of nature to the highest pitch of refinement may be traced by the historian, the philosopher, and the naturalist, sufficiently to obviate all objections against the strongest efforts to instruct and civilize the swarms of men in the American wilds, whose only natural apparent distinction is a copper-colored skin. When the present war ceases to rage, it is hoped that humanity will teach Americans of a fairer complexion to use the most strenuous efforts to instruct them in arts, manufactures, morals, and religion, instead of aiming at their extermination. It is true at this period, when war was raging through all the United States, few of the tribes of the wilderness appeared to be contented with their own native inheritance. They were everywhere stimulated by the British government to hostility, and most of the inhabitants of the wilderness seemed to be in array against their former colonies. This created a necessity in Congress to act offensively against the rude and barbarous nations. Defensive war against any nation, whether civilized or savage, is undoubtedly justifiable both in a moral and political view, but attempts to penetrate distant countries and spread slaughter and bloodshed among innocent and unoffended tribes, too distant to awaken fears, and too simple and unsuspicious to expect approaching destruction from those they had never injured, has no warrant from heaven. Even in the present war, instances may be adduced of the effects of civilization, which often soften the most savage manners, one of which may be here recorded. A part of the Muskingum tribe had professed themselves Christians of the Moravian sect. They considered war of any kind as inconsistent both with the laws of religion and humanity. They refused to take any part with the numerous hostile tribes of savages in the war against Americans. They observed with more rationality and consideration than is generally discovered in more civilized nations that the Great Spirit did not make men to destroy, but to assist and comfort each other. They persisted in this placid demeanor until some of their savage neighbors were so enraged that they forcibly removed them from their former settlement, and after committing great cruelties and destroying a number of them, placed the remainder near the Sandusky. Their removal was in consequence of orders from the British commander at Detroit. They remained for some time in the enjoyment of their own simple habits, but some suspicions were afterwards infused among the settlers on the Monongahela that their dispositions were not friendly to the Americans. It is painful to relate that on this slight pretense, a number of Americans embodied themselves and marched to the Moravian town, where the principal men had repaired by permission to reap the harvest they had left standing in the fields. The Americans followed them and barbarously murdered the whole of this innocent and inoffensive band. The whites at first decoyed them by a friendly appearance, which induced them to collect themselves together. When thus collected, they, without resistance, suffered themselves to be bound and inhumanly butchered. They died professing their full expectation that their troubles would soon be at an end. Thus they fell as martyrs to religion by the hands of a people who had much longer professed themselves adherents to the principles of Christianity. This instance of the treachery and cruelty of the whites is one among many other proofs of the truth of an observation made by a gentleman afterwards, that the white savages were generally more savage than the copper-colored, and that 9 times out of 10 the settlers on the borders were the aggressors, that he had seen many of the natives who were prisoners at Fort Washington, that they appeared to be possessed of much sensibility and gratitude, that he had discovered some singular instances of this among them, very honorable to the human character, before the advantages of the examples of civilized nations had reached their borders. Footnote: a young American officer of great sensibility and penetration, who fell at the battle at the Miamis, 1791. End of footnote. In short, no arguments are necessary to adduce the truth or impress on the minds either of the philosopher or the politician that it will be the indispensable duty of the American government, when quietly established by the restoration of peace, to endeavor to soften and civilize, instead of exterminating the rude nations of the interior. This will undoubtedly be attempted in some future period, when uncultivated reason may be assisted, when arts, agriculture, science, and true religion may enlighten the dark corners which have been obscured by ignorance and ferocity for countless ages. The embrowned, dusky wilderness has exhibited multitudes of men, little distinguished from the fierce animals they hunted, except in their external form. Yet, in a few instances, the dignity of human nature has been discovered by traits of reason and humanity, which wanted only the advantages of education to display genius and ability equal to any among the nations that have hunted millions of those unhappy people out of existence since the discovery of America by Europeans. But it is a pleasing anticipation that the American Revolution may be a means in the hands of Providence of diffusing universal knowledge over a quarter of the globe that for ages had been enveloped in darkness, ignorance, and barbarism. End of section 15.
Section 16 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 14. Foreign Negotiations, Dissensions among the American Commissioners, Dean recalled, Mr. Adams appointed, Mr. Lee and Mr. Adams recalled, Spain declares war against England, Mr. Jay sent to the Court of Madrid, Sir George Collier's expedition to Virginia, his sudden recall, ravages on the North River, depredations in the state of Connecticut, in aid of Governor Tryon and his partisans, General Washington seizes Stony Point, recovered by the British, Penobscot expedition, destruction of the American Navy. It has already been observed that in an early stage of the American contest, some gentlemen were deputed to negotiate and to endeavor to secure the assistance of several European nations. This had had such an effect that at the period we are now upon, the United States were in strict alliance with France, and were considered in a partial and respectful light by some of the first powers of Europe. Yet difficulties both at home and abroad, which had scarcely been viewed in theory, were now realized and felt with poignancy by the true friends of their country. The objects that employed the abilities of Congress at this period were of such magnitude as required the experience of ancient statesmen, the coolness of long-practiced politicians, and the energies of virtue. The Articles of Confederation offered to the consideration of each legislative in the several states in 1776 had been rejected by some and suspended by others. It is true they were now recently ratified by all of them, but were scarcely yet established on a permanent basis. They had to arrange, harmonize, and support the new permanent army, collected from every part of the Union, and now interwoven with foreign volunteers from different European nations, and in the rear of every other difficulty at home, they had to guard with all possible discretion against the innumerable moral and political evils ever the inevitable consequence of a depreciating currency. Abroad, they had a task of equal difficulty, to heal the animosities that existed and to conciliate the differences that had arisen among the American ministers at the court of France. or to prevent the fatal consequences of their virulence towards each other. This was expressed in strong language in their letters to Congress, nor was it a secret in the courts of England or France, and in some instances, perhaps it was fomented by both. In the infancy of Congress, in the magnitude of the new scenes that were opening before them, and in the critical emergencies that sprung up on untrodden ground, they, through hurry or inexperience, had not in all instances selected men of the most impeccable characters to negotiate with foreign powers. Perhaps in some of their appointments, they did not always look so much at the integrity of the heart as at the capacity of the man for the arts of intrigue, the ready address, and the supple accomplishments necessary for the courtier, both to ensure his own reception with princes and to complete the wishes of his employers in his negotiation with practiced statesmen. Silas Deane, Esquire, a delegate to Congress from the state of Connecticut, was the first person who had been vested with a foreign commission. He embarked as a commercial agent in behalf of the United States in 1776, and was afterwards named in the Honorable Commission for a treaty of alliance with the court of France, in conjunction with Dr. Franklin and Arthur Lee, Esquire. Mr. Deane had nothing to recommend him to such a distinguished and important appointment, except a degree of mercantile experience, combined with a certain secrecy or cunning that wore the appearance of knowing things much beyond his ability, and the art of imposing a temporary belief of a penetration far beyond his capacity. His weakness and ostentation, his duplicity, extravagance, and total want of principle were soon discovered by his constituents, but they placed the most unlimited confidence in the great abilities, profound knowledge, and unshaken patriotism of the venerable and philosophic Franklin. His warm attachment to his native country had been evinced in numberless instances during his long residence in England, as agent to the British court, both for the Massachusetts and the state of Pennsylvania. Before he left England in 1775, he had taken unwearied pains to reconcile on the principles of equity and sound policy the breach between Great Britain and America. In the beginning of hostilities, he repaired to Philadelphia, was chosen a member of Congress, and by his decided Republican principles soon became a favorite in the councils of America, a stable prop of her independence, and the most able and influential negotiator they could send abroad. The character and principles of Mr. Arthur Lee gave equal reason to expect his most energetic endeavors to support the interests and weal of America. He had resided in England for several years as agent for the state of Virginia. Invariably attached to his native country and indefatigable in his efforts to ward off the impending evils that threatened it, he had communicated much useful intelligence and advantageous advice to the patriotic leaders in various parts of America, and by his spirited writings and diligent exertions he procured them many friends in England. He was a man of clear understanding, great probity, plain manners, and strong passions. Though he loved America sincerely, he had at this period great respect and affection for the parent state, and his predilection in favor of Britain appeared strongly when balanced with the idea of an American connection with the House of Bourbon. The celebrity of Dr. Franklin has been so just and so extensive that it is painful even for the impartial historian who contemplates the superiority of his genius to record the foibles of the man, but intoxicated by the warm caresses and unbounded applause of all ranks, among a people where the art of pleasing is systemized, he appeared, notwithstanding his age and experience, in a short time after his residence in France, little less a Gallican than an American. This might be from policy. It was said, however, that he attached himself to the interests of the Count de Vergennes, who, though he countenanced the American Revolution and cooperated in measures that completed it, yet it was afterwards discovered that he secretly wished to embarrass their counsels and dreaded the rising glory of the United States. Whatever suggestions there might have been, it was never supposed that Dr. Franklin was led off from his attachment to the interests of America. Yet this distinguished sage became susceptible of a court influence that startled his jealous and more frigid colleague, Mr. Lee. Thus the trio of American agents at the court of France were designated by peculiar traits of character. Yet the respectability of Dr. Franklin and Mr. Lee was never lessened, either at home or abroad, notwithstanding some variation of opinion. But Mr. Dean, immersed in the pleasures of a voluptuous city, a dupe to the intrigues of deeper politicians, not awed by the aged philosopher, the tool of the French minister, the supple instrument of military characters, ambitious of rising in the fair field of glory in America, he wasted the property and bartered away the honors of his country by promising offices of rank to 50 gentlemen at a time. He sent so many of these on to America with the most flattering expectations of promotion, and even with ideas of superseding the previous appointments of Congress. Many of the French officers who arrived on the American continent at this early period with these fallacious hopes were men of real merit, military experience, and distinguished rank, but it was impossible for Congress to provide for them all according to their views without deranging the whole army and disgusting many of their best officers. Thus disappointed, some of them returned to France under a cloud of chagrin that was not easily dissipated. The indiscretion of Mr. Dean did not terminate with his engagements to individual strangers, for while he embarrassed Congress and the army with his contracts, and his country by squandering the public moneys, he had the audacity to propose in a letter to a person of influence that a foreign prince should be invited to the command of the armies of the United States. From the outlines of these heterogeneous characters, it is not strange that the most incurable animosities took place among the commissioners and arose to such a height as to endanger the interests of an infant republic. Indeed, the fate of America in some measure depended on the vigor, integrity, prudence, and unanimity of her ministers abroad. But dissension ran to such a pitch among them that it exposed them not only to the censure of their country, but to the derision of Britain. Consequently, an immediate recall of some of the American commissioners became necessary, and an order passed in Congress December 1777 that Silas Deane, Esquire, should immediately return to America. No reasons were offered for his recall, and Mr. John Adams of the state of Massachusetts was chosen to succeed as commissioner in behalf of the United States at the court of France. Mr. Deane arrived in America a short time after the treaty with France had been received and ratified by Congress. He assumed an air of importance and self-confidence, and as guilt frequently sends a hue and cry after justice, in order to hoodwink the multitude, and calls loudly for vengeance on such as are about to detect its villainy, he offered a most inflammatory address to the public, complaining of ill usage and vilifying Mr. Lee in the grossest terms. He criminated every part of his public conduct, charged him with betraying his trust, corresponding with gentlemen in England, impeding as much as possible the alliance with France, disclosing the secrets of Congress to British noblemen. At the same time, he cast the most virulent and insidious reflections on his brother William Lee, agent for Congress at the courts of Vienna and Berlin. End of section 16. Section 17. Of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 14, Part 2. He claimed much merit relative to the Treaty of Alliance with France, and complained heavily that Congress delayed giving him an opportunity of vindicating his own character by an immediate public investigation. By these bold suggestions and allegations, so injurious to Congress and to their ministers, the public mind was for a time greatly agitated. But the attack on individual character was defeated by the exertions of some very able writers, who laid open the iniquitous designs and practices of the delinquent and his abettors. While Congress parried the abuse, they defended their own measures and quieted the clamors of party against themselves by calling Mr. Dean to a hearing on the floor of their house. With the guise of innocence and the effrontery of guilt, he evaded the scrutiny by pleading that his papers and vouchers were all left in Europe, where, he alleged, the necessity of his own private affairs required his immediate presence. In short, though it was obvious that he had abused his commission, rioted long at the public expense, and grossly slandered some of its most faithful servants, yet by the influence of certain characters within, and a tenderness for some without, who might be exposed by too strict an investigation, Congress were induced to suffer him again to leave the continent and return to Europe, though not as a public character, yet without punishment or judicial censure. He afterwards wandered from court to court and from city to city for several years, at last reduced to the extreme of poverty and wretchedness. He died miserably in England. Parties ran very high in Congress relative to the dissensions among their ministers. Mr. Lee had many friends in that assembly, Dr. Franklin had more, and it was necessary for some mercantile speculators in that body to endeavor to throw a veil over the character of Mr. Dean, that under its shade the beams of clearer light might not too deeply penetrate their own. Mr. Robert Morris, a member of Congress from the state of Pennsylvania, had undoubtedly been concerned in some very profitable contracts in company with several French and American gentlemen, besides Mr. Dean, and under the sanction of public negotiations, the most lucrative trade was carried on, and the fortunes of individuals accumulated beyond calculation. Monsieur Girard, the French minister residing in Philadelphia, was warmly attached to Dr. Franklin and Mr. Dean, and not less disgusted with Mr. Lee. It may be observed that there are few public ministers so tenacious of the dignity of their own character and conduct as not occasionally to descend to rank among partisans and exert the influence of public character to gratify private interests or resentment. Thus, Mr. Girard, an idolizer of Dr. Franklin, supported Mr. Dean, offered pensions to take off the defenders of Mr. Lee, and instead of retaining the superiority of an ambassador from one of the first monarchs in Europe, appeared the champion of a club of merchants and speculators. He resided but a short time in America. The Chevalier de la Luzerne superseded him as ambassador to the United States in the summer of 1779. The reasons for his recall do not appear, but it was undoubtedly a prudent measure in the court of France not to suffer a minister to continue after he had discovered himself attached to a party. Within a few months after Congress had made a new arrangement of ministers, and Mr. Adams had been sent on in the room of Mr. Dean, both Mr. Adams and Mr. Lee were directed to repair immediately to America, and Dr. Franklin was appointed sole minister at the court of France. Americans, it is true, were early initiated in the spirit of intrigue, but they were not yet so thoroughly acquainted with the maneuvers of courts as to investigate the necessity of the sudden recall of those gentlemen. Mr. Lee had been very severely censured by many for his want of address and his unaccommodating spirit at the French court, nor had he been more successful in his negotiations with Spain. He had resided some months at Madrid as commercial agent, with powers, if practicable, to negotiate a treaty or to obtain a loan of money for the use of the United States. But he was unacceptable to the court, and though he had the abilities of a statesman, he was without the address of a courtier, and his negotiations in Spain redounded little to the advantage of America. Yet such was his integrity, that he found it not difficult on his arrival in his own country to reinstate himself fully in the good opinion of the public, and to wipe from his character the aspersions of malice or prejudice. Mr. Adams returned rather disgusted at the early revocation of his commission, and the unexpected order thus speedily to leave the court of France. He did not himself repair to Congress, but retired privately to his seat in Braintree, where he employed himself for a time in preparing a concise statement of the situation and political connections of the different powers of Europe, which he laid before Congress with his opinion of their interests and their views relative to America, and recommended the pursuance of every step that might tend to strengthen the alliance with France. Nothing can more strongly exhibit the pride Mr. Adams felt in the Gallican alliance and his zeal for supporting it than the expressions contained in his own letters on this subject on his first residence at the court of France. But in Mr. Adams' communication to Congress, he advised them strenuously and invariably to guard against their principles in government and the manners that were so opposite to the constitutions of America and the character of a young people who might hereafter be called to form establishments for a great nation. Mr. Adams continued in this retired and mortified situation for some months, but we shall see in its place he was afterwards called upon to transact affairs of a very high and important nature. It was obvious to everyone that from the family interests and connection between the courts of France and Spain, the latter would undoubtedly cooperate with the views and designs of the former, but no treaty, alliance, or any public countenance had yet been given to the Americans by the court of Madrid. Spain had oscillated between peace and war for several years. She had offered herself as mediatrix among the contending powers, but insulted on the seas and her interference rejected by Britain, she appeared in June 1779 to act a more decided part. The Marquis de Almodovar, the Spanish ambassador in London, delivered a rescript to Lord Weymouth about this time, couched in language that amounted to a declaration of war. On these movements in Europe, Congress thought proper again to send an envoy to the court of Spain. John J. Esquire, a gentleman from the state of New York, was appointed to this mission, September the 27th, 1779. His capacity was equal to the business. He was well received, and his public character acknowledged. Yet his negotiations were of little consequence to America, while he resided in Spain. Perhaps apprehensive that the spirit of freedom and revolt might extend to her own colonies, Spain chose to withhold her assistance. No treaty with the United States was effected by Mr. Jay's mission, no concessions with regard to the free navigation of the Mississippi, or any security for trade to the Bay of Honduras were obtained. On these important points he was directed to negotiate as well to solicit a loan of money, sufficient to assist the United States in the pursuit of their measures, but no loan of money of any consequence was to be drawn from the frigid and wary Spaniards. Notwithstanding the necessities of America were fully exposed by her minister, the highest favor he could obtain was the trivial loan of £4,000 or £5,000. Spain had no predilection in favor of the independence of the British colonies. She had always governed her own plantations beyond the Atlantic with a very arbitrary and despotic hand. Their contiguity and intercourse with the North Americans led her to fear that the spirit of freedom might be contagious, and their own subjects there so far infected as to render it necessary to keep themselves in reserve against future contingencies. This they had done for some time after a war was announced between Great Britain and France, but it was impossible for them to continue longer neutral. France was now involved in war, and decidedly supporting the Americans and England in expectation of a union of interests and a modification of the same line of conduct in the courts of the several branches of the House of Bourbon, had in various instances discovered a hostile disposition, and stood in a menacing posture, as if both her sword and her flag were ready to meet the conjoined forces of both France and Spain. His Catholic Majesty, thought it impossible for him longer to delay an explicit declaration of his intentions. He published a long manifesto, giving the reasons for a declaration of war. He ordered his ambassador to retire from the court of London, without taking leave, and in a schedule published by order, great moderation was professed. In a paper delivered to Lord Weymouth by the Marquis d'Almodovar, it was observed that the causes of complaint given by the Court of London not having ceased, and that court showing no disposition to give reparation for them, the King has resolved and orders his ambassador to declare that the honor of his crown, the protection which he owes to his subjects, and his own personal dignity do not permit him to suffer their insults to continue, and to neglect any longer the reparation of those already received, and that in this view, notwithstanding the pacific dispositions of his Majesty, and even the particular inclination he had always had and expressed for cultivating the friendship of his Britannic Majesty, he finds himself under the disagreeable necessity of making use of all the means which the Almighty has entrusted him with to obtain that justice which he has solicited by so many ways without being able to acquire it. In confiding on the justice of his cause, His Majesty hopes that the consequences of this resolution will not be imputed to him before God or man, and that other nations will form a suitable idea of this resolution by comparing it to the conduct which they themselves have experienced on the part of the British ministry. End of section 17. Section 18 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 14, Part 3. While things stood thus in the courts of Great Britain, France, and Spain, indecisive movements for a time in the southern states of America engaged the public attention and awakened anxious apprehensions for the result. At the same time that a scene of rapine and plunder was spread through the central parts, Virginia, New York, and Connecticut. The predatory excursions of this year were begun early in the summer. An expedition to the Chesapeake, under the command of Sir George Collier of the Navy and General Matthews of the Army, served no other purpose than to alarm, distress, and impoverish the towns of Portsmouth, Suffolk, and other places in the state of Virginia that fell under the spirit of conflagration. They stayed but a short time there, after enriching themselves with the spoils of the inhabitants, and leaving many of those who had once basked in the lap of affluence, the houseless children of poverty, they left the state by order of the British commander-in-chief. The pleasant line of towns bordering on Long Island Sound in the state of Connecticut were the next who felt the severe consequences of this mode of war. From British troops supported and covered by the squadron under Sir George Collier, who was recalled from the Chesapeake to aid similar measures farther north. About the beginning of July, Governor Tryon, with a number of disaffected Americans, and General Garth with a ravaging party of British troops and German Jaegers, landed at New Haven, took possession of the town with little resistance, plundered and insulted the inhabitants, on whom every cruelty was perpetrated, except burning their houses. This was delayed from their thirst for plunder and the barbarous abuse of the hapless females, who fell sacrifices to their wanton and riotous appetites. Hurried afterward by their avarice for new scenes of plunder and misery, they left New Haven and repaired to Fairfield, where they landed on the 7th of the month. This place suffered a still more cruel and severe fate. Their landing at Fairfield was but feebly opposed. The militia indeed made a faint resistance, but soon retreated, and left their property and in many instances their families to the mercy of the enemy. This was not altogether from the want of courage, but from the consciousness of their own comparative weakness and strange delusive opinion that the generosity and compassion of the British would be exercised towards them when they found only a few women, children, and aged men left who seemed to have thrown themselves on their compassion. The historian would willingly draw a veil over the wanton outrages committed on the wretched inhabitants left in the town, most of them of the feebler sex, some of them the first characters in the place, from a wish to save their property, and an indiscreet confidence in the honor of Governor Tryon, with whom they had been personally acquainted, and who had formerly received many civilities at their houses, risked their own persons and their honor, amidst the fury of a conquering enemy, on a kind of sham protection from a man who had forgotten the obligations of politeness and the gratitude due to those who had treated him with every mark of genteel hospitality. The principal ladies of Fairfield, whom from their little knowledge of the world, of the usages of armies, or the general conduct of men when circumstances combined to render them savage, could not escape the brutality of the soldiery by shewing their protections from Governor Tryon. Their houses were rifled, their persons abused, and after the general pillage and burning of everything valuable in the town, some of these miserable victims of sorrow were found half distracted in the swamps and in the fields, whether they had fled in the agonies of despair. Tryon endeavored afterwards to exculpate his own character, and made some futile excuses for his conduct. He would have justified himself on the principles of policy, when he felt the indignation expressed against him for his want of humanity. But policy, reason, and virtue equally revolt at modes of war that eradicate from the mind not only the moral feelings, but the sense of decency, civility, and politeness. The avidity of this party was by no means satiated by the distresses of New Haven and the total destruction of Fairfield. The neighboring towns of Norwalk and Greenfield suffered a similar fate. The waste of property in shipping and merchandise was there more complete. The whole coast, equally defenseless and exposed to their ravages, expected to fall in the same way, but whether from their compunction or policy is uncertain. Whichever it might be, Sir Henry Clinton thought proper to check the career of depredation, so grateful to the feelings of Tryon and his partisans, by a sudden recall within 10 days of their landing at New Haven. Meantime, General Washington had kept himself in a defensive and respectable situation in the central parts of America, but without a movement for any very capital stroke after the derangement of a well-concerted plan for an attack on the city of New York. He had expected the aid of the French squadron from the West Indies to facilitate this judicious measure. The militia of several states had been collected to assist in the design. The army was in high spirits, sanguine expectations were formed, and everything promised success to the enterprise. But the Count d'Estaing, perhaps ambitious to subjugate one of the states to the arms of his master, and not dreaming of effectual resistance to a force, both by land and sea, that might reasonably be thought sufficient for the most capital enterprise, instead of uniting first with General Washington, and covering his attempt on New York by a respectable necessary naval force, he thought proper to hazard the reduction of Georgia on his way and then repair northward. But his attack on Savannah, his unexpected repulse and retreat, not only retarded but totally prevented the decisive stroke contemplated by Washington, nor less apprehended by Clinton, who was thereby induced to order the evacuation of Newport and draw off all his troops from that quarter. Newport and its environs had been infested with the inconvenience and misery of an army and navy on their borders, from the seizure of that place by Earl Percy in 1776 to their relief in the present year. The circumstances above related put it out of the power of General Washington to prosecute the feasible system he had meditated. The militia were diminished, and many of the Continental troops returned as usual at the expiration of their terms of enlistment. General Clinton had made several attempts to draw the American commander from his strong and defensible post in the Jerseys, as well as to induce him to divide his army to oppose the desultory invasions and depredations on the defenseless seacoast. But General Washington very well knew the advantages that he might lose by weakening the main body of his army, and was too wise and judicious to be ensnared by the maneuvers of the British commander. The first object of Sir George Collier's speedy recall from the ravage of the borders of Virginia was to cooperate with General Vaughan in the important movements on the North River. The principal design of this project was to obtain some important posts on the Hudson. General Vaughan, who had before been distinguished for his feats there, still commanded on the Hudson but higher up the river. On the arrival of the squadron commanded by Sir George Collier, they united and immediately made themselves masters of Stony Point on the one side, and Verplank's Neck on the other. After these places had been dismantled the preceding autumn by Sir Henry Clinton, the Americans had in part repaired the works. In each port they behaved with spirit and resolution, but as their numbers were inconsiderable and their works unfinished, they soon surrendered prisoners of war on the single condition of humane treatment. Not many days after this event, General Washington ordered a detachment of his most active troops under the command of General Wayne to attempt the recovery of Stony Point. This bold and vigorous enterprise was conducted in a manner peculiarly honorary to the officers and soldiers, but not altogether so consistent with humanity. They were directed not to load their pieces, but to depend on the bayonet. One who appeared discontented at the order was shot on the occasion. Though this summary mode of punishment is severe, it was designed to prevent the effusion of blood, doubtless had the British been early alarmed by the fire of the American arms, and the carnage would have been greater. The works had been repaired and strengthened with great alacrity, and 2 British regiments, some loyal Americans, and several companies of artillery, left in garrison by General Vaughan. On the evening of the 5th of July, after a difficult and hazardous march, Wayne reached, surprised, and recovered the post in spite of the valiant opposition within. Colonel Fleury, an amiable, ambitious, and spirited young Frenchman, had the honor and peculiar pleasure of striking the British standard with his own hand. This youthful officer had received the thanks of Congress and the honorary rewards of the soldier for his distinguished bravery in several previous encounters. General Wayne was himself slightly wounded in this enterprise, but the united applause of the Commander-in-Chief, of Congress, and of his country, which he received, would have been ample compensation for more painful wounds or much severer fatigue. The acquisition of this post was more honorary than important. An attempt to have held it would have been fruitless. It had been previously determined in a council of war that on the success of Wayne the works should be demolished and the stores brought off. End of section 18. Section 19 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 14, Conclusion. Sir Henry Clinton immediately set his whole army in motion for the relief of Verplank's, which was momentarily expected to surrender to the American arms, and for the recovery of Stony Point. He succeeded to his wishes, and after only 3 days' possession, this contested spot a third time changed its masters, and the command of the whole river for a time continued in the hands of the British. Several other maneuvers took place about this time near New York and the more central parts of the country that kept the spirit of enterprise and the honor of the arms of the states. But a more consequential affair occupied the public attention in the eastern extreme of the American territory. A Colonel McLean had been sent with a party of British troops from Halifax to land at the mouth of the Penobscot within the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts. He erected a fort and established a strong post in a convenient situation for harassing the trade and distressing the young settlements bordering on the province of Nova Scotia. When this intelligence was received at Boston, the hardy and enterprising spirit of the men of Massachusetts did not hesitate to make immediate preparation to dislodge an enemy whose temerity had led them to encroach on their state. It had been only 4 years since the commencement of hostilities with Britain. America was then not only without a navy, but without a single ship of war. The idea of constructing and equipping a maritime force was ridiculed by some, and thought chimerical and impracticable by others. But the human mind is generally capable of accomplishing whatever it has resolution to undertake. By the industry and vigilance of public bodies and private adventurers, they had in this short period acquired a navy that a century before would have made a respectable figure among the most warlike nations. And within 10 days after Maclean's attempt was known at Boston, the Warren, a handsome new frigate of force commanded by Commodore Saltonstall, and 17 other continental state and private ships, were equipped, manned, victualled, and ready for sea. They were accompanied by an equal number of transports with a considerable body of land forces, who embarked in high spirits and with the sanguine expectation of a short and successful expedition. This business was principally conducted by the state legislature, nor would the gentlemen of the Continental Navy Board consent to hazard the public ships unless the commanding officers were positively enjoined to execute their design immediately. They were apprehensive that any delay might give opportunity to send a superior force from New York. From the dilatory conduct of the Americans after they reached Penobscot, these apprehensions were realized, and before any efficient movements had taken place, Sir George Collier, with a heavy squadron under his command, appeared for the relief of Maclean. General Lovell, who commanded by land, was a man of little military experience, and never made for enterprise sufficient to dislodge the British from a post of consequence, or in any way complete an undertaking that required decision, promptitude, and judgment. Commodore Saltonstall proved himself a character of as little enterprise, and in this instance of less spirit than the commander of the troops designed to act on shore. Thus, by the shameful delay of both, and to the mortification of many brave officers who accompanied them, the expedition terminated in the disgrace of both army and navy, and the total destruction of the fleet. On the first appearance of Sir George Collier, the American shipping moved up the river with a show of resistance, but in reality to escape by land from an enemy they seemed not to have expected nor had the courage to face. 2 of their best ships fell into the hands of the British. The remainder, lighted by their own hands, suffered a complete conflagration. The panic-struck troops, after leaving their own ships, chagrined at the conduct of Saltonstall, and disgusted with the inactivity, indecision, and indiscretion of Lovell, made their escape through the woods in small, indiscriminate parties of soldiers and sailors. On their way they agreed on nothing but in railing at their officers, and suffering the natural ebullitions of disappointment to spend itself in mutual reproaches. With fatigue, hunger, and difficulty, they reached the settlements on the Kennebec and brought the intelligence of their own defeat. It was not in the power of the infant states to repair their maritime loss during the war, and to complete the ruin of their little navy. Some of their best ships were lost in the defense of Charleston, the year following, as will be seen hereafter. What added to the mortification of this last stroke was that these ships were prepared and ready to sail in order to prosecute a very flattering expedition projected by the gentlemen of the Navy Board in the Eastern Department when they received an express order from Congress to send them to South Carolina. Scarcely any single event during the great contest caused more triumph to Britain than this total demolition of the beginning of an American navy. So successful and enterprising had they been, that a gentleman of the first information has observed that the privateers from Boston in 1 year would defray more than 1/2 the expense of that year's war, By their rapid progress, they had given the promise of a formidable appearance on the ocean, that in time they might become a rival even to the proud mistress of the seas. But this blow gave a fatal stroke for the present to all farther attempts of the kind. After the loss of Charleston, the ship Alliance and the Dean frigate were the only remnants left of the American Navy. These were soon after sold at public auction, the Navy boards dissolved, and all maritime enterprise extinguished, except by private adventurers. They were also much less fortunate after the loss of the public ships than they had been at the beginning of the war. It was calculated that 2 out of 3 were generally captured by the British after the year 1780. Time may again revive the ambition for a naval power there, as America is abundantly replete with everything necessary for the equipment of fleets of magnitude and respectability. After all, it may justly be considered that the constructing a national fleet is but an addition to human misery, for besides the vast expense of such equipments, the idle and licentious habits of a vast body of sailors, a naval armament is only a new engine to carry death and conflagration to distant, unoffending, innocent nations. The havoc of human life on the ocean, the great balance of evil resulting from naval engagements, if duly weighed in the scale of equity or humanity, might lead the nations, with one general consent, to their total annihilation. Yet undoubtedly, the pride of empire and the ambition of kings will still induce them to oppress their subjects for the purpose of enhancing their own power by this hard instrument of human carnage, and that they will continue to waft death and destruction to every corner of the globe that their maritime thunders can reach. It is true the etiquette of modern courts usually introduces some plausible apologies as a sort of prelude to the opening of those real scenes of war and destruction which they are preparing to exhibit by that monstrous engine of misery, a naval armament. They usually trumpet forth the godlike attributes of justice, equity, mercy, and above all, that universal benevolence and tenderness to mankind, with which their respective courts or sovereigns are supposed to be infinitely endued, and deplore in the most pathetic strains those very evils which they are bringing on, and those miseries which they are exerting their utmost power to inflict. But it is to be feared it will be long before we shall see a combination of powers, whatever may be their possessions, whose ultimate object is the establishment of universal equity, liberty, and peace among mankind. War, the scourge of the human race, either from religious or political pretenses, will probably continue to torment the inhabitants of the earth until some new dispensation shall renovate the passions, correct the vices, and elevate the mind of mortals beyond the pursuits of time. The world has so long witnessed the sudden and dreadful devastation made by naval armaments that it is unnecessary to expatiate thereon. It is enough to observe that the splendid display of maritime power has appeared on the largest theaters of human action. The proudest cities have unexpectedly been invaded, and the inhabitants involved in misery, by the fire of those floating engines in too many instances to particularize, from the first building up of British Navy to the early attempts of America to strengthen themselves by following the example of the parent state in building and equipping ships of war in the beginning of their opposition to British power. The truth of this observation may be evinced by a single instance of surprise and capture by a little squadron under the command of Commodore Hopkins, only the second year after hostilities commenced between Great Britain and the colonies. The American commander of a ship, only 36 guns, and 7 or 8 smaller vessels, surprised New Providence, captured the governor, lieutenant governor, and other officers of the crown, seized near 100 pieces of cannon, and carried off all the warlike stores on the island. But not habituated to the usual cruelties exercised on such occasions, though they continued there 2 or 3 weeks, they offered no insult to the inhabitants, and took possession of no private property without paying for it. This was an instance of lenity that seldom falls under observation, where men have been longer inured to scenes and services that harden the heart, and too frequently banish humanity from the breast of man. The small naval armament constructed by the United States, did not continue long enough in existence either to attempt great enterprise or to become hardened by the cruel achievements consequent on the invasion of cities, towns, and villages, and desolating them by sudden torrents of fire poured in upon their inhabitants. Some future day may, however, render it necessary for Americans to build and arm in defense of their extensive seaboard and the preservation of their commerce, when they may be equally emulous of maritime glory, and become the scourge of their fellow men on the same grade of barbarity that has been exhibited by some other nations. End of section 19.
Section 20 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 15, Part 1. A retrospect of some naval transactions in the West Indies, 1778 and 79. Affairs in Georgia concisely reviewed. General Lincoln sent to take the command at the southward. The Count d'Estaing's arrival in Georgia. Savannah closely besieged by the combined forces of France and America. Repulsed by General Prevost. The Count d'Estaing leaves the southern climb. The Count Pulaski slain in Georgia. Some anecdotes of Count Kosciuszko. From the concise mode of narration hitherto observed in these annals, a particular detail of naval operations will not be expected. Yet it is necessary to look a little back and observe that an insular war had raged between the British and French in the West Indies during the winter of 1778, though they had not yet received any intelligence that a formal declaration of hostilities between those two potent nations had taken place. The island of Dominica was seized by the Marquis de Boille, governor of Martinico, as early as September 1778, but the terms imposed on the inhabitants by the conqueror were so mild that they scarcely felt the change of sovereignty. No licentious rudeness or avaricious pillage was permitted by the humane and honorable commander, who, through all his conduct in the West Indies, exhibited a specimen of that generous compassion always honorary to the conqueror and to human nature. The loss of the island of Dominica was peculiarly mortifying to the court of St. James, as it had been ceded to Great Britain on the last peace, as a kind of balance of accounts, after a very expensive war with the House of Bourbon. Admiral Barrington, with a considerable force, lay at this time at Barbados, in a very anxious and inactive state. He had yet no orders for hostile operations, but he was soon after relieved by the arrival of 5,000 men commanded by General Grant, convoyed by 6 ships of the line and a number of frigates, under the direction of Commodore Hotham. The want of instructions and even of intelligence that might be depended on had exceedingly embarrassed the British admiral, but on Hotham's arrival, an expedition to the island of St. Lucia was prosecuted with celerity and success. The Chevalier de Macaude, the commandant, took all the precaution of a brave and judicious officer. The main point was to prevent the completion of the British success until he should be relieved by the arrival of the French squadron from Boston, which he had the highest reason every moment to expect. The Count d'Estaing had formed the design, and was in force sufficient to have swept all the Leeward Islands before the junction of Admiral Barrington and Commodore Hotham, but interrupted in his military progress by a second violent gale in the American seas, and seldom a favorite of fortune. He did not appear in sight of St. Lucia until the last French flag was struck. He, however, made some spirited but successless efforts for the recovery of the islands. The vigilance and valor of the British commander defeated this design, to which was added the mortification of repeated disappointment in several valiant rencounters with the bold and resolute English. Though the Count d'Estaing's ships were equal in force, and experience had shown that neither his officers nor seamen were deficient in courage, yet after he quitted St. Lucia, he apparently declined a general engagement, and within 10 days withdrew to Port Royal. He was frequently insulted while there by the appearance of challenge from the British flag, but he still adhered to his own system of inaction, determined to undertake no capital stroke before the arrival of fresh reinforcements from Europe. It was not until the month of June, 1779, that this event took place, when the arrival of Monsieur de la Motte, with everything necessary for the most vigorous naval operations, excited the Count d'Estaing to immediate enterprise. The first object of attack was the valuable island of St. Vincent's, which had formerly cost much British blood to arrest and secure, by the cruel attempt to exterminate the unfortunate and innocent Caribs. After the easy acquisition of this island, the Count proceeded to the Grenades. He there landed 2,000 or 3,000 men under the command of Count Dillon, a brave Irish officer in the French service. He also headed a strong column himself, and attempted to carry the most defensible fortress by storm. His superiority of strength ensured his success, and Lord Macartney was obliged to offer a surrender on the proposals of capitulation he had at first rejected. But the Count received and treated the governor's flag with an unbecoming hauteur. He made new and severe proposals in such a tone of defiance and contempt that both the governor and the inhabitants chose rather to surrender at discretion than to bind themselves to such hard conditions, as neither the customs of nations nor the justice of courts had usually required. There is much reason to believe that the Count d'Estaing did not exercise all the lenity that ought to be expected from a brave and generous conqueror. On the contrary, after this new acquisition, the inhabitants were plundered and distressed. An unbounded license raged among the soldiery, till their excesses were checked by the humanity of Count Dillon, who paid every attention to the miseries of the people, and supported by his own regiment, he rendered the condition of the conquered island less deplorable. The capture of St. Lucia was in a degree fatal to the conquerors. The noxious air of an unhealthy island in a burning climate did more than the sword of France to waste the veterans of Britain. Sickness and mortality raged and cut down the troops, and the squadron weakened by the departure of Admiral Byron to convoy the homeward bound fleet of merchantmen. Nothing of consequence was attempted in his absence. When he returned, both St. Vincent's and the Grenades were in the hands of the French, but so uncertain were the accounts at first received of the wretched situation of the Grenades, that the British commander determined to hazard an attempt for their relief. This brought on a general, though not a decisive action. It was supported on both sides with laudable spirit and bravery, but they finally separated without victory on either. Yet the proud and gallant Britons, whose island has long assumed the haughty style of mistress of the seas, who had justly boasted their superiority in naval engagements, could not forbear to claim the advantage of this doubtful conflict. But it is certain the wounded fleets under the admirals Barrington and Byron found some difficulty in reaching St. Christopher's, without some of their ships falling into the hands of their enemy. The Count d'Estaing returned to Granada, and the lilies of France waved for a short time in the West Indies, and the English admirals were insulted in their turn by the parade of the French fleet before St. Christopher's. In the same manner, Lord Barrington had before maneuvered in vain at Martinico, without provoking the Frenchmen to engage. After these partial successes, the Count d'Estaing soon left the tropical seas and repaired again to the American continent, where the assistance of a naval force was by this time exceedingly wanted to aid the operations of the Americans. The Southern campaign had been opened the preceding year by the seizure of the capital of Georgia. Sir Henry Clinton, late in the autumn of 1778, had ordered a large detachment of Hessian, British and provincial troops under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Campbell to Savannah to assist Major General Prevost in further prosecuting some unexpected advantages he had already gained. They were escorted by a small squadron under the command of Commodore Parker and arrived in the Savannah the 27th of December. The state of Georgia was at this time in a very weak and defenseless situation. Their frontiers were exposed to the depredations of the savages, and the rude incursions of the wild borderers who mixed with them had often been so troublesome as to require the call of the Southern militia to check their outrages. Colonel Campbell landed his troops immediately on his arrival in the river, and by several spirited and judicious movements possessed himself of the town of Savannah, the capital of the state, with little or no loss, and obliged General Robert Howe, a gentleman of North Carolina, who commanded a party of about 800 militia, to retreat with precipitation. Orders had been previously given by Sir Henry Clinton to Major General Prevost, the commander-in-chief in East Florida, to repair with all possible expedition to aid the invasion and reduction of Georgia. This active officer immediately collected his remote cantonments, and with dispatch and perseverance, pushed his march through a hot and barren country of great extent. Surmounting innumerable difficulties and fatigue, he reached Sunbury and took possession of the town and garrison before Campbell had possessed himself of Savannah. Both military skill and a great degree of humanity marked this first important enterprise in the South. The British commander forbid that the inhabitants not in arms should be either molested or plundered, and by promises and proclamations encouraged them to submit quietly to the authority of the parent state. Some acquiesced by inclination, and many, impelled by necessity, appeared ready to enlist under the British standard. Others, of more bold and independent sentiments, made their escape across the river with the hope of an asylum in South Carolina. These successes again encouraged the disaffected and disorderly people who had long infested the back parts of North Carolina to renew their incursions. Those insurgents had been apparently subdued, their leaders cut off, and their spirits broken in the beginning of the American convulsions, but their aversion to the reigning powers in that state still rankled in their breast. They had impatiently waited an opportunity of displaying it in all the fierce and cruel modes of savage war, in conjunction with the neighboring Indians to whom they had attached themselves. They considered this a favorable crisis, and again left their rural occupations. They united with some scattering parties of the same description on the borders of South Carolina and Georgia, embodied themselves, and in their progress committed every outrage that might be expected from an armed banditti. But on an attempt to join General Prevost, their main body was attacked by the provincial militia. Many of them cut off and others taken prisoners. The remainder fled to the frontiers of Georgia, where, with their old associates of the wilderness and all others who could be collected in the back settlements, they united to aid General Prevost in his future operations. The hazardous situation of Georgia and the imminent danger of the wealthy state of South Carolina has spread an alarm that awakened to immediate exertion for the recovery of the one and the security of the other. General Lincoln has seasonably been sent forward to take the command in the Southern Department. He reached Savannah a short time after Colonel Campbell's arrival there, but he found himself not in so eligible a situation as might have been wished. The number of troops under his command fell far short of expectation. The artillery and stores were insufficient, and every difficulty was enhanced by the want of order and discipline in the militia, who refused to submit to the necessary subordination of armies. They left their posts and retired at pleasure. End of section 20. Section 21 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 15, Part 2. General Lincoln, however, consistent with his usual disposition on all occasions, endeavored to make the best of his situation. He continued himself at Purisburg with the main body of his army, and ordered General Ashe, with a detachment of 2,000 men, to take a strong post at a place called Briar Creek. His design was to secure the upper part of the country against the Loyalists, who were everywhere collecting their strength. Soon after General Ashe had taken possession of the advantageous post, that in the opinion of the principal officers promised perfect security, General Prevost formed and executed the design of surprising him there. To facilitate this judicious measure, he made such arrangements on the banks of the Savannah as took off the attention of General Lincoln. At the same time, he ordered his brother, Colonel Prevost, by a circuitous march of 50 miles, to fall unexpectedly on Ashe's party at the creek. The success of the enterprise justified the design. The whole detachment was routed, many of them killed or captured, and thus the way was open for the Loyalists and their copper-colored allies in the back country to join Prevost without molestation. After this action, which took place the 3rd of March, the two parties, separated by the river, continued quietly in their own posts till the latter end of the month of April, 1779. Savannah, Sunbury, and some other towns were in the hands of the British, and the state by proclamation laid under military government. Yet the people in general considered themselves as belonging to the Union. General Lincoln, zealous to procure an election of delegates to Congress from Georgia, which he expected would be impeded by violence, left his advantageous situation on the lower part of the river and moved towards Augusta. This was rather an unfortunate movement, as, had he continued his first station, he might have secured Charleston for a time. Indeed, there was then little reason to apprehend any immediate danger in that quarter. Yet he had the precaution to leave General Moultrie with 1,500 men to guard the passes of the river. The campaign in Georgia, however, did not redound much to the advantage of the American arms, or to the honor of General Lincoln. It was thought by some he did not discover himself a judicious and experienced commander, who had penetration to calculate on fortuitous events, or resources at hand to extricate himself when they unexpectedly took place. Yet he supported a character, cool and brave, under a variety of disappointments. He was, however, led a circuitous dance from place to place by the rapid movements of General Prevost through the state of Georgia, until he was obliged to move with more serious prospects towards Charleston. The loss of his party at Briar Creek was no more than might have been expected from the activity and vigor of such an officer as Prevost, attending more to his military renown than to the political maneuvers of the state. While General Lincoln was canvassing for the election of a delegate to Congress, the commander on the forces of his antagonist was intent only on winning success in the field. Footnote: there was an effort to defeat this measure, which General Lincoln judged it necessary to counteract, bearing in mind the interest of his country in civil as well as military matters. End of footnote. The active Prevost seized the moment of advantage, suddenly crossed the river in different parts, and penetrated into South Carolina with little or no opposition. The party under Moultrie, consisting chiefly of militia, on seeing themselves surrounded on all sides by British troops, retreated hastily and secured themselves within the city of Charleston. General Prevost, having thus succeeded, even beyond his most sanguine expectations, in several enterprises of considerable moment, inspired by his own wishes, and prompted by the importunities of the Loyalists, he formed the bolder resolution of pushing directly for Charleston. He arrived at the river Ashley on the 11th of May, crossed it, and within a few days summoned the city to surrender. Nor had he any reason for some time to regret their determination. He had every assurance from the disaffected Americans that Charleston would surrender without resistance, and that they had the best authority for this decided opinion. Nor did they, in this instance, so totally disappoint the expectations of their British friends, as they frequently had done, and continue to do in their subsequent informations. It is true, General Prevost did not immediately succeed to the full completion of his hopes, but on the first summons to surrender, the citizens assured him that no opposition should be made, provided they might be permitted to continue in a state of neutrality to the conclusion of the war. This was the only instance in America of an offer made so derogatory to the honor of the Union. No single state, whatever might be their distresses, ever expressed a wish during the war to be bound to a neutral repose, while their sister states were bleeding at every pore in support of the general cause. The conduct of the citizens of Charleston cannot be accounted for, but from the momentary panic to which the human mind is liable, when sudden danger presses, before it has time to collect its own fortitude and to act with decision and dignity, consistent with previous principles. South Carolina had been distinguished for the bold and active part taken by that state against the measures of Britain. This was the first Southern colony after Virginia who adopted the proposal of a general Congress, nor was there now any reason to suspect any defection in the bulk of the inhabitants, though there were numbers in the city of Charleston attached to the royal cause. Her patriots were unshaken, her officers brave, and the subsequent conduct of the people at large, and the sufferings of individuals, effaced the unfavorable impressions this proposal might have left, had it not have been wiped off by the vigorous opposition afterwards made to a successful foe, both in their councils and in the field, amidst the extremes of peril, personal danger, and public misery. General Prevost, encouraged by success, and animated by his own personal bravery, united with the hope of subduing Charleston, rejected the offer of neutrality, and all further negotiation ceased. The city immediately recovered its former spirit, and preparation was made on both sides for the most vigorous attack and defense. General Lincoln had been rather slow in his movements, having been deceived into an opinion that Prevost had no further design in crossing the river Savannah than to procure forage and provisions. But soon finding more serious consequences were to be expected, he hastened on with his whole force, and made his arrangements with so much judgment and alacrity that General Prevost thought it prudent to withdraw from before the city, lest his retreat should be cut off. He encamped his troops on the islands before the harbor, where he continued for some time, in anxious expectation of reinforcements from New York, this being delayed until the advance of the intense heats and the sickly season of that country came on, which rendered it in some measures necessary to suspend all vigorous operations in that quarter. Little else was done there this year, except the indiscriminate plunder of the wealthy inhabitants of the state, who were out of the reach of the protection of their friends. Affairs in Georgia requiring his presence, General Prevost repaired there soon after the siege of Charleston was raised. He left a force sufficient in Port Royal to encourage his friends by keeping up the appearance of some permanent establishment in that province, where he meant soon to return. But early in the autumn, the unexpected arrival of the squadron, commanded by the Count d'Estaing, on the southern coast, gave the flattering promise of a new face to the affairs of Georgia and the Carolinas. The admiral, on his arrival in the Savannah, landed his troops with all possible expedition, and in conjunction with the Americans, laid siege to the capital of Georgia. On the 16th of September, he demanded a surrender of the town to the arms of the King of France. The summons was in language that rather excited terror than allurement, and would have determined an officer of less courage and resolution than General Prevost to defend the town to the last. The situation of Savannah was indeed scarcely defensible, but resolved not to yield but in the last extremity, Prevost returned a polite but evasive answer to the French commander, and had the address to obtain a truce of 24 hours to deliberate. In this fortunate interval, the arrival of Colonel Maitland, with a body of troops from Port Royal, put an end to deliberation. All thoughts of surrender were laid aside, and a most gallant defense made. The town was bombarded for 5 days, to the great terror and distress of the inhabitants. In this predicament, General Prevost wrote and requested the Count d'Estaing that the women and children, with his own wife and family, might be sent down the river and placed under the protection of one of the French ships. After some delay, he had the mortification to receive an unpolite and cruel refusal. As this answer was signed by both the French and American commanders, censure for want of humanity fell equally on each. It is not improbable the severe language it contained might be designed to intimidate and hasten a surrender, and thereby prevent the further effusion of blood. Yet there appeared a want of generosity unbecoming the politeness of the Frenchman, and inconsistent with the well-known humanity of the American commander. Of this they seemed to be sensible within a few days, when fortune began to change her face. Apologies were made both by General Lincoln and the Count for this indelicate refusal. Great tenderness was therein expressed for the inhabitants, and every civility offered, particularly to the General's lady and family, and a ship assigned as an asylum for herself and friends. General Prevost replied to this offer of kindness, extorted by apprehension, if not by fear, that what had been once refused in terms of insult could in no circumstances be deemed worth the acceptance. The little time gained by this short parley for the purposes of civility was improved by General Prevost to great advantage in every view. With indefatigable industry, he strengthened his old works, and assisted by the spirit and capacity of Mr. Moncrief, the chief engineer, he erected new ones with celerity and judgment, very honorable to his military talents, and consistent with his zeal and alacrity on all occasions. The arrival of an officer of Colonel Maitland's abilities, accompanied by a considerable reinforcement, was indeed a very fortunate circumstance at this period for the commander at Savannah. Stimulated by a recent affront, and urged on by constitutional activity and a thirst of military applause, General Prevost seemed to bid defiance to the combined forces of France and America, and repulse them in every quarter. End of section 21. Section 22 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 15, Conclusion. On the 11th of October, the besiegers attempted to storm the town, but were defeated with great slaughter. They, however, kept up the appearance of blockade until the 16th, when they requested a truce to bury their dead and take care of their wounded. This was readily granted by Prevost. The conflict had been bloody indeed, and both sides equally wished for time to perform this charitable and necessary business. Soon after the melancholy work of interring many of their comrades, the French and the Americans took the advantage of a dark and foggy night, and retreated with all possible precipitation, breaking down the bridges as they passed, to impede the pursuit of their enemies if they should be disposed to follow them. The Count d'Estaing had now an opportunity to survey the condition of his fleet, when he found the sailors sickly and dispirited, nor was the army less so, from the unhealthiness of the climate and the failure of their late enterprise. The Count himself had been wounded in the course of the siege, and several of his best officers were either killed or wounded. The loss of very many of his men in this decided repulse, with the disgrace that every commander thinks he incurs when the expectation of success from great designs is defeated, deeply affected the mind of the French commander. Thus, unfortunately disappointed in the spirited attack on the town of Savannah, he found it necessary, from a combination of untoward circumstances, to abandon the design of recovering Georgia. In a short time after this, the French commander bade adieu to the American seas. He had never been disgraced by any deficiency in military ability, knowledge, or spirit, while acting on behalf of the United States. Yet a series of disappointments had prevented his reaping the laurels, the just reward of bravery, or rendering much service to his allies, who had received him with the highest marks of cordiality and expectation. Footnote: the Count d'Estaing was some years afterwards one of the proscribed victims who fell by the guillotine, amidst the distractions and misery of his own country, in the infuriated reign of Robespierre. End of footnote. The summons of the Count d'Estaing to the British commander to surrender the capital of one of the states to the arms of his most Christian Majesty was neither pleasing, prudent, or productive of harmony and confidence between the French under his command and the Americans. It occasioned some discontent at the time, and perhaps some jealous Americans did not regret that the recovery of Georgia was left to an officer of merit in their own corps, sent forward afterward by General Greene, who had been the favorite of fortune, of the people, and of the commander-in-chief. This was done at a period of complicated difficulties, when General Greene could not leave the state of South Carolina himself, but in the abilities of General Wayne he had the utmost confidence. The event showed that this confidence was not misplaced. We shall see hereafter General Wayne was sent on, and had the honor of finishing the war in Georgia, and the pleasure of witnessing the evacuation of the troops from their strongholds in that state, annihilating the last remains of British authority there, and recovering again the youngest of the sister states to their former union. In the repulse before Savannah, many valorous and gallant officers fell. Among this number was the Count Pulaski, a Polish nobleman of great consideration. His bravery and enterprising spirit was celebrated not only in America but in his own country. He had once, amidst the fierce contest of the miserable Polanders, in the height of his zeal for the recovery and support of the liberties of that nation, seized on the person of the King of Poland, and for a time held him his prisoner. And though he had with him only 2 or 3 whom he deemed trusty associates, one of them relented and betrayed him. The king was saved, and the count obliged to fly. Footnote: a full narrative of this transaction may be seen in Cox's Travels Through Russia, etc., etc. End of footnote. A few years after, he repaired to America, where he found a field ample enough for the exercise of his soldierly talents, to cherish his love of freedom, and to support the military character of his ancestors and his family, many of whom survived this heroic officer. The Count Pulaski was not the only officer of his nation who distinguished himself in the American War, but the Count Kosciuszko, for his firmness, his valor, and his sufferings, merits particular notice. He was amiable and virtuous as well as brave, and supported a character that will seldom be passed over in silence in a history of either Poland or America. The Kingdom of Poland had for years exhibited a most striking monument of human misery. The struggles for liberty, the pride of the nobles, the ignorance and barbarism of the peasantry, their unstable confederacy, the usurpation of princes, and the interference of neighboring monarchs rendered it a scene of carnage for several ages previous to the expulsion of Stanislaus Augustus, their ruin as a nation, and the partition of their country among the crown despots that surrounded them. The sovereign of Poland was dethroned. The kingdom partitioned among the trio combined for that purpose: Frederick, Catherine, and Maria Theresa. Many of the inhabitants were sent to plant colonies in the cold and distant regions of Siberia and other parts of the Russian domains. Some of the nobility survived under the heavy yoke of their victorious neighbors. Others had fled and lent their valorous arms to England, France, and America. This melancholy termination of efforts grounded in nature and reason might, for a time, smother the spark of freedom implanted in every human breast, which yet almost every man, on ascending the pedestal of power, endeavors to extinguish in the bosom of all but himself. But the misfortunes of their country, or their own personal sufferings, could not deaden the flame of liberty and independence that burnt in the bosoms of many noble-minded Polanders. Though the distractions of their native country obliged them to abandon it, their enthusiasm was cherished amid strangers, and they lent their veteran abilities to aid the emancipation of others from the degrading yoke of servitude. The character of no one of this distinguished band became more conspicuous than that of the Count Kosciuszko, who survived the fierce conflicts to which his bravery exposed him through the Revolutionary War in America. His subsequent transactions in his native country, his valor, his misfortunes, and his renown are too well known and too replete with extraordinary events to record in this place. While we admire the patriotism, bravery, and other virtues that adorned the characters of some individuals among the heroes of that ill-fated country, the deplorable situation of Poland should forever stand as a memento to all other nations who claim or maintain any degree of freedom. By their private animosities, jealousies, and dissensions, all confidence was destroyed and all patriotism annihilated, except in the bosoms of a few, until their king was dethroned, the nobility laid prostrate, the country drenched in blood, and the people driven into banishment by thousands, and obliged to wear out a miserable existence under the authority of the arbitrary sovereigns who had completed the ruin of their liberty, their government, and their country. The history of Poland is indeed an awful lesson to every republic, where the seeds of dissension begin to spring up among the people. Those symptoms, when nurtured by faction and strengthened by jealousies among themselves, render the people an easy prey to foreign invaders, and too generally terminate in a tragic catastrophe, similar to that of the Poles, who no longer continued a distinct nation, after the era which had stained the annals of Europe by the shameful partition treaty, preconcerted in the cabinets of Russia, Prussia, and Germany, and announced by the joint declaration of their sovereigns in 1773. The inhabitants of Poland were now the subjects and slaves of those usurping princes, who had seized and divided the kingdom, transplanted the inhabitants of the territory to distant regions, and repeopled the depopulated country with the soldiers of Prussia, Germany, and the northern potentates, who had long trained their own subjects to bend in silence under the yoke of servility. The partition of Poland was a singular event in the history of Europe, where the great powers, inattentive to the balance about which they had for many years expressed so much solicitude, viewed this extraordinary circumstance with little or no emotion. Whatever may be the effect on the general state of Europe, it is yet uncertain whether the Poles lost so much by the change as has been apprehended. It is difficult to say in what period of the history of Poland they had any proper claim to the honor of a free, republican form of government. The people had long groaned under the unbridled oppression and power of a proud domestic aristocracy. The absurd veto, designed as a check, only increased their discontents, jealousies, rancor, and confusion. They had indeed a nominal king, more the subject of a foreign power than the sovereign of his own country. They are now under the iron hand of foreign despotism. Whether that, or the scourge of aristocracy, is the most productive of vassalage and misery, is a problem yet undecided. We leave deeper politicians to determine if they can, which is the most abhorrent to the feelings of humanity. But the discussion of the constitution of the Poles is not a part of the business of the present work. Yet the ruin of Poland may be viewed as an example and a warning to other nations, particularly to those who enjoy a free, elective, representative government. End of section 22. Section 23 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 16, Part 1. Sir Henry Clinton and Admiral Arbuthnot sailed for South Carolina. Charleston invested. Capitulates. General Lincoln and his army prisoners of war. General Clinton returns to New York. Lord Cornwallis's command in civil administration in Charleston. Mr. Gadsden and other gentlemen suspected and sent to St. Augustine. Much opposition to British authority in both the Carolinas. The Count de Rochambeau and the Admiral de Tierney arrive at Newport. British depredations in the Jerseys. Catastrophe of Mr. Caldwell and his family. Armed neutrality. Some observations on the state of Ireland. Riots in England. Cursory observations. From the unavoidable inactivity of the Americans in some parts of the continent, and the misfortunes that had attended their arms in others, in the summer of 1779, Sir Henry Clinton was left without any impediment to prosecute a well-concerted expedition to the southern colonies. The opulence of the planters there, the want of discipline in their militia, the distance and difficulty of reinforcing them, and the sickly state of the inhabitants, promised an easy conquest and a rich harvest to the invaders. The summer and autumn passed off, and it was late in the month of December before General Clinton embarked. He had a strong body of troops, and a forcible squadron commanded by Admiral Arbuthnot, who accompanied him, but they proceeded heavily on their way, and it was not until the ensuing spring was far advanced that the Admiral passed the bar and made himself master of the harbor of Charleston. The Americans flattered themselves for some time that they should be able to make an effectual resistance to the passage of the British fleet up the Cooper River. This passes on one side, and the Ashley runs on the other of the town of Charleston. But they soon abandoned every ground to the potent English, except the town of Charleston, which they determined to defend to the last extremity. Governor Rutledge was vested by the legislature with very extraordinary powers, which he was obliged to exercise in their full latitude. This gentleman had acted on all occasions with spirit and judgment, becoming his character both as a soldier and a magistrate. He immediately called out the militia and published a proclamation directing all the inhabitants who claimed any property in the town to repair immediately to the American standard on pain of confiscation. Though couched in strong and severe terms, this proclamation had little effect. The manifest reluctance of some to oppose the power of Britain, the dread that others felt of so potent an adversary, the ill success of the American arms in Georgia, the surprise of the cavalry and other parties that were coming to their relief, the arrival of British reinforcements, and the rapid advance they made to conquest, appalled the inhabitants and obliged the citizens soon to abandon all hopes of even saving their town. The first summons of surrender on the 16th of April was rejected by the American commander, though it announced the dreadful consequences of a cannonade and storm, which would soon be the unhappy fate of Charleston. Should the place in fallacious security or the commander in wanton indifference to the fate of the inhabitants delay a surrender? General Lincoln replied that he had received the joint summons of General Clinton and Admiral Arbuthnot, that 60 days had passed since it had been known that their intentions against the town of Charleston were hostile, in which time had been afforded to abandon it, but that duty and inclination pointed to him the propriety of defending it to the last extremity. After this decided answer, the most vigorous operations ensued on both sides, but with great advantage in favor of the British, till the 8th of May, when Sir Henry Clinton again called on the American commander to prevent the further effusion of blood by an immediate surrender. He warned him that, if he refused this last summons, he should throw on him the charge of whatever vindictive severity and exasperated soldiery might inflict on the unhappy people, that he should wait his answer till 8 o'clock, an hour beyond which resistance would be temerity. General Lincoln summoned a council on this occasion, who were unanimously of opinion that articles of capitulation should be proposed. Footnote: this general view of the siege and surrender of Charleston is principally collected from General Lincoln's defense and apology in a letter to General Washington, which the author was favored with the perusal of in manuscript by General Lincoln. End of footnote. The terms offered were several of them rejected, others were mutilated, and all relaxation or qualification being refused by the British commander. It was as unanimously agreed that hostilities should again recommence on the ensuing day. Accordingly, an incessant fire was kept up from the 9th to the 11th, when an address from the principal inhabitants of the town and a number of the country militia expressed their satisfaction in the terms already offered by General Clinton. At the same time, the lieutenant governor and council requested that negotiations might be renewed and that they might not be subjected to the horrors of a city taken by storm. The militia of the town had thrown away their arms, the troops on the lines were worn down with fatigue, and the provisions exhausted, thus closely invested on every side, a disaffected, factious party within, no hopes of succor from without, and all possibility of retreat cut off. General Lincoln again offered terms of surrender, little variant from Clinton's proposals. They were acceded to, and signed the 12th of May. Though the conditions were not the most favorable to the inhabitants or honorary to the soldier, yet perhaps they were as lenient as could be expected from an enemy confident of success, and as honorable as could be hoped in the desperate situation to which the Americans were reduced. The Continental troops were to retain their baggage, but to remain prisoners of war until exchanged. 7 general officers were among the prisoners. The inhabitants of all conditions would be considered as prisoners on parole, but they soon experienced the severities usually felt by a conquered city. All who were capable of bearing arms were enrolled in the British service, and the whole state laid under heavy contributions. The loss of Charleston, the great number of the captured, and the shipping that fell in its defense was a severe blow to America. Much censure was cast on General Lincoln for neglecting a timely retreat and for attempting the defense of the town against such superior force, both by sea and land. But it must be acknowledged he did all that could be expected from an officer of courage to save the capital and the state, or from a man of humanity to make the best possible terms for the inhabitants. He afterwards justified the measure by a full detail of the invasion and the motives for his conduct to the satisfaction of the commander-in-chief and of his country. General Lincoln certainly had great merit in many respects, yet it may be observed, few officers have been equally fortunate in keeping up the eclat of character, who have so frequently failed in enterprise. For, however unjust it may be, yet military fame more generally depends on successful events than on bold design or judicious system. Victory had seldom followed in the rear of any of his exploits, yet from his known bravery and patriotism, from his acknowledged integrity and honor, he escaped the censure frequently attached to unfortunate heroes, and which might have fallen heavily on a general of more doubtful character. Before Sir Henry Clinton left Charleston, some new and severe regulations took place that could not well be justified, either by the letter or the spirit of the capitulation. All persons in the city were forbidden the exercise of their commercial pursuits, excepting such as were the decided friends of the British government. Confiscation and death were threatened by proclamation to any who should be found in arms, unless in support of royal authority. All capable of bearing arms were enrolled for British service. Such as had families were permitted to continue near them and defend the state against their American brethren. Those who had none were required to serve 6 months out of 12 in any part of the southern states. Many inhabitants of the principal towns, and indeed a great part of the state of South Carolina, despairing of any effectual resistance, and unwilling to abandon their connections and their property, laid down their arms, and submitted either as prisoners of war or subjects to the King of Great Britain, and even congratulatory addresses were fabricated and signed by great numbers of respectable characters in Charleston, and offered to the British commanders on the success of their arms. Thus, from motives of interest or fear, many who had appeared to be actuated by higher principles stooped to the servile homage of the sycophant, and flattered the victors on the conquest of their country, an acquisition that reduced their countrymen to beggary, and themselves to slavery. Soon after these arrangements, Sir Henry Clinton, vainly flattering himself that he had entirely subdued one wealthy colony at the extremity of the continent, and that everything was in a hopeful train for other brilliant strokes of military prowess, left the command of the Southern Department to Lord Cornwallis, and repaired himself to New York. His lordship immediately detached a strong body under the command of Lord Rawdon to march, to subjugate, and guard the frontiers, while he turned his own attention to the commercial regulations and the civil government of the newly conquered province. But he soon found the aid of auxiliaries, impelled by fear, or stimulated by the hope of present advantage, is not to be depended on, and that voluntary combats are the only social ties considered among mankind as binding on the conscience. On the first opportunity, many persons exchanged their paroles for certificates of their being good subjects, and immediately returned to the country or to the neighboring state, and stimulated their friends to resistance. A remarkable instance of this nature was exhibited in the conduct of Colonel Leal, a brave American officer, who, after an exchange of the parole, decamped from the British standard and carried off with him a whole battalion to the aid of Colonel Sumter and other spirited officers who were in motion on the borders of both the Carolinas. The new regulations and the hard conditions enjoined on them by the conqueror were highly resented by many of the principal inhabitants of Charleston. Their dissatisfaction was so apparent that they soon fell under the suspicion and displeasure of the commander. Some allegations were brought against them, though far from being sufficiently founded. They were charged with treasonable practices and designs against government, arrested in their beds, sent on board prison ships, confined and treated with great rigor, and in a short time sent off to St. Augustine. Among this number was Lieutenant Governor Gadsden, a gentleman early distinguished for his patriotism, his firmness, his republican principles, and his uniform exertions to emancipate his country from the shackles of British government. Nothing appeared to justify the severities exercised towards these gentlemen, nor was there any reason to believe they had forfeited their honor. The rigorous policy of a conquering foe was all that was offered in vindication of this step. But it is certain the Carolinas, in general, evince the difficulty of holding men by political fetters, while the mind revolts at the authority that has no claim but what arises from the laws of conquest. End of section 23. Section 24 of History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, Volume 2, by Mercy Otis Warren. Chapter 16, Part 2. Lord Rawdon was extremely active on the frontiers. No exertion was wanting on the part of this valiant officer to bring the whole country to a united submission to royal authority, and a diversion was made in the Chesapeake, under the Commander General Leslie, in favor of the operations in the Carolinas. Yet within 2 months after the surrender of Charleston, opposition to British government again resumed a stable appearance. Marches, countermarches, surprise, pillage, and massacre had for some months pervaded the frontiers, and whichever party gained the advantage, the inhabitants were equally wretched. But a particular detail of the miseries of the southern states through this period would be more painful than entertaining to the reader, and is a task from which every writer of humanity would wish to be excused. Imagination may easily paint the distresses when surveying on the one side a proud and potent army flushed with recent success and irritated by opposition from an enemy they despised, both as Americans and as rebels. Their spirit of revenge continually whetted by a body of refugees who followed them, embittered beyond description against their countrymen, and who were joined by a banditti who had no country but the spot that yielded a temporary harvest to their rapacious hands. Rapine and devastation had no check. On the other side, little less severity could be expected from a brave and high-spirited people, not softened by the highest refinements of civilization, warmed by the impulse of retaliation, driven almost to despair, and under every painful apprehension for their lives, their property, their liberty, and their country. These were joined by the soldiers of fortune and the fierce borderers, who had not yet been taught to yield quietly, either to military or civil subordination. The most striking outrages were everywhere committed, but no partisan distinguished himself more on either side than a Colonel Tarleton, who made himself a character in the ravage of the Carolinas, equally conspicuous for bravery and barbarity, and had the effrontery afterwards in England to boast in the presence of a lady of respectability that he had killed more men and ravished more women than any man in America. Footnote: this was so highly resented by the lady who had before been his friend, that by her influence she defeated his hopes as a candidate for a member of Parliament. End of footnote. But not the loss of their capital, the ravage of their country, the proscription of some of the principal inhabitants, and the total ruin of some of the wealthiest families could subdue the spirit of independence and the aversion to British government that had taken deep root in the bosoms of most of the inhabitants of the southern states. Sumter, Morgan, Marion, Lee, Caswell, Rutherford, and other brave officers continually counteracted the intrigues of the Loyalists and attacked, harassed, and frequently defeated the British parties that were detached to the various parts of the country to enforce submission. Nor did the repulse in Georgia, the loss of Charleston, nor the armament sent to the Chesapeake by Sir Henry Clinton in favor of Lord Cornwallis's movements in the smallest degree check the vigorous efforts of these spirited leaders, by whose assistance a new face to the affairs of their country was soon restored. France had this year given a new proof of her zeal in favor of American independence. The Count de Rochambeau arrived on the 11th of July at Newport with 6,000 land forces, under cover of a respectable squadron commanded by the Admiral de Turney. They brought the promise and the expectation of farther and immediate support, both by land and sea. Some ineffectual movements were made on both sides in consequence of these expectations, and on the arrival of Admiral Graves in New York, with 6 sail of the line and some transports, a feint was made by Sir Henry Clinton, with the assistance of those fresh reinforcements, immediately to attack the French at Rhode Island. This plan was diverted by General Washington's preparation to embrace the favorable opportunity to strike a decided blow by the reduction of New York. All the states east of the Delaware discovered their readiness by all possible exertions to cooperate in the design. But amidst all the preparation and sanguine hope of the Americans, an account was received, equally mortifying to the United States and to their allies already in America, that Admiral de Guichen had sailed from the West Indies directly for France, instead of repairing with all his forces, as was expected, to aid the united operations of Washington and Rochambeau. The Admiral de Turney died soon after at Newport. It was thought by many that this brave officer fell a sacrifice to chagrin and disappointment. After the failure of these brilliant hopes, little more was done through the summer in the Middle or Eastern Department, except by skirmishing parties, which served only to keep up the hope of conquest on the side of Britain, while it preserved alive some military ardor in the American army. But so uncertain are the events of war, that the anticipation of success, the pride of victory, or the anguish of disappointment alternately play on the passions of men, until the convulsion gives place to tranquillity and peace, or to the still solemnity of melancholy, robbed of all its joys. General Washington found himself at this time unable to do much more than to guard against the uncertain inroads of a powerful fleet and a hostile army. It could not be congenial to the feelings of the military character, endowed with the spirit of enterprise, to be placed in a situation merely defensive, while too many circumstances forbade any concentrated plan that promised any decision of the important object for which the United States was struggling. While thus situated, the British troops were frequently detached from New York and Staten Island to make inroads and by surprise to distress and destroy the settlements in the Jerseys. The most important of their movements was about the 25th of June, when General Knyphausen, with about 5,000 regular troops, aided by some new levies, advanced upon the right wing of the American army, commanded by Major General Greene. Their progress was slow until they arrived at Springfield, where they were checked by a party of the Americans. They had yet done little mischief on their march, but at Springfield they burnt most of the houses in the town, and retired from thence to Elizabethtown. After some time they advanced from Elizabethtown with the whole of their infantry, a large body of cavalry, and 15 or 20 pieces of artillery. Their march was then rapid and compact. They moved in 2 columns, one on the main road leading to Springfield, the other on the Vauxhall Road. Major Lee, with the horse and pickets, opposed the right column, and Colonel Dayton with his regiment the left, and both gave as much opposition as could have been expected from so small a force. General Greene observed in a letter to Congress that the American troops were so extended to guard the different roads leading to the several passes over the mountains that he had scarcely time to collect them at Springfield and make the necessary dispositions previous to the appearance of the enemy before the town, when the cannonade commenced between their advance and the American artillery, posted for the defense of the bridge. Every prudent measure was taken by General Greene to confront and repel the invaders, protect the inhabitants, and secure the retreat of his own parties, when danger appeared from superior numbers. The Generals Maxwell and Dickinson, the Colonel Shreve, Ogden, and others, at the head of their regiments, exhibited the highest specimens of American bravery, but the enemy continued to press on in great force. Their left column began an attack on Colonel Angell, who was posted to secure a bridge in front of the town. The action was severe and lasted about 40 minutes, when superior numbers overcame obstinate bravery and forced the American troops to retire over the second bridge. After various military maneuvers, skirmishes, and retreats, General Greene took post on a ridge of hills, from whence he detached parties to prevent the burnings of the enemy, who spread conflagration wherever it was in their power, and retreated towards Elizabethtown. This detachment from the British Army finished their marauding excursion and recrossed to Staten Island, July the 23rd. The outrage of innocents and instances too numerous to be recorded of the wanton barbarity of the soldiers of the King of England as they patrolled the defenseless villages of America was evinced nowhere more remarkably than in the burnings and massacres that marked the footsteps of the British troops as they from time to time ravaged the state of New Jersey. In their late excursion, they had trod their deleterious path through a part of the country called the Connecticut Farms. It is needless to particularize many instances of their wanton rage and unprovoked devastation in and near Elizabethtown. The places dedicated to public worship did not escape their fury. These were destroyed more from licentious folly than any religious frenzy or bigotry to which their nation had at times been liable. Yet through the barbarous transactions of this summer, nothing excited more general resentment and compassion than the murder of the amiable and virtuous wife of a Presbyterian clergyman, attended with too many circumstances of grief on the one side and barbarism on the other, to pass over in silence. This lady was sitting in her own house, with her little domestic circle around her, and her infant in her arms, unapprehensive of danger, shrouded by the consciousness of her own innocence and virtue, when a British barbarian pointed his musket into the window of her room and instantly shot her through the lungs. A hole was dug, the body thrown in, and the house of this excellent lady set on fire and consumed with all the property it contained. Mr. Caldwell, her affectionate husband, was absent. Nothing had ever been alleged against his character, even by his enemies, but his zeal for the rights and his attachment to his native country. For this he had been persecuted, and for this he was robbed of all that he held dear in life, by the bloody hands of men, in whose benevolence and politeness he had had much confidence until the fated day, when his mistaken opinion led him to leave his beloved family, fearless of danger, and certain of their security, from their innocence, virtue, and unoffending amiability. Mr. Caldwell afterwards published the proofs of this cruel affair, attested on oath before magistrates, by sundry persons who were in the house with Mrs. Caldwell, and saw her fall back and expire, immediately after the report of the gun. This was, as observed by Mr. Caldwell, a violation of every tender feeling, without provocation, deliberately committed in open day, nor was it ever frowned on by the commander. The catastrophe of this unhappy family was completed within 2 years by the murder of Mr. Caldwell himself by some ruffian hands. His conscious integrity of heart had never suffered him to apprehend any personal danger, and the melancholy that pervaded all on the tragical death of his lady, who is distinguished for the excellence and respectability of her character, wrought up the resentment of that part of the country to so high a pitch that the most timid were aroused to deeds of desperate heroism. They were ready to swear, like Hannibal against the Romans, and to bind their sons to the oath of everlasting enmity to the name of Britain. End of section 24.